Gender is a word in the English language which comes, as so many English words do, from the Middle French, ultimately from the Latin genus, which means sort or kind, type. For a very long time it had this very meaning in English. As late as the 1600s you can see writers like Shakespeare using it to mean type, like in all genders of herbs. It doesn't mean that some of the herbs are men and some are women. It just means different types of herbs. Somewhere around the 1700s, the meaning shifted to mean sex. I mean, it makes sense, right? A gender of herb is thyme or rosemary. A gender of person is their sex. It's a type of person. I can't say exactly where this happened, but it's worth noting both that the grammatical sense of the term gender already existed, so grammatical gender was already a concept, and also the fact that this era, the pre-Victorian, going into Victorian era in England, was one of rapid shifting euphemisms, not wanting to be associated with the lower class and their coarse language, being strangely obsessed with sex, and it makes sense that they'd want a word that was different to the word they used for intercourse to refer to men and women. It's equally difficult to find where exactly the modern meaning comes from, but it was certainly popularized in academia by the 1970s, in feminist circles especially, and it means, well, you know, it's a structure that is not identical to sex, but built on top of it. Not everything that we carry out as men or women is tied to our biology. I mean, there's no gene for wearing a suit and tie, for instance. There's no gene for wearing high heels, and in fact, 300 years ago it was men who wore high heels, not women. This idea of sex being a kind of biological construct and gender being a social one is one that's been widely popularized since 2010. You find it all over the place, and I happen to think it's a very useful distinction. Some people, however, complain about this. A lot. I've seen in previous videos where I've talked about gender the notion that gender is made up. You know, it was invented in the 1970s by a cabal of academics. It's not a conspiracy. It's just, you know, finding a new word for something. Just because we didn't have a word for something doesn't mean that that thing literally didn't exist before. You know, we discover new things all the time. We create new concepts. I think it's actually quite simple to see that there is something that isn't sex but is correlated to it. Anyone with common sense could really observe this. Take the suit and tie example again. We know that there's nothing biological about this. Men haven't always worn suit and ties, and yet, inexplicably, it's something expected as the male business wear. Whatever you want to say about gender, its nature, how it operates, what it is exactly, it's blatantly clear that it's there, that it exists as a thing in the world. And side note, if you're really concerned about 1970s academic language taking over everyday speech, then stop using the word meme. I've never seen anyone complain about the word meme. No one seems to care about that one, for some reason. And no one seems to care about the fact that it's changed meaning from what Richard Dawkins initially intended it to mean. No, changes in meaning and popularization of academic vocabulary are both normal processes. There is no conspiracy. But all this, of course, has to get you thinking. What I've said there is that gender is distinct from sex, that it exists as something on top, but what most people mean when they say that gender doesn't exist is another statement, which is also often explicitly said, that gender is the same as sex. You might think these are the same general point. I mean, on the face of it they are. They're saying that the word gender has no additional meaning outside of sex, i.e., it doesn't really exist. But there is actually an additional argument being made here. A lot of the time, when asked to clarify what they're saying, the people who are saying that gender is the same as sex, they'll often concede that they are technically distinct concepts, but will insist that they correspond one-to-one. I think that's what this sentence needs to be taken as meaning. Gender might not technically be the same thing as sex, you know, there's still suit and ties and dresses and all this weirdness going on top of sex, but if you are biologically a sex, then you have a gender that corresponds to it. I have two things to say about this. The First thing is I want to turn briefly to the Bugis people. In Bugis society, the 5-gender system has been in place and an important part of society for about 600 years. As well as having groups that roughly correspond to cis men and cis women, there are kalalai, roughly corresponding to trans men, kalabai, trans women, and bisu, a kind of other group, agender, androgynous, non-binary-ish priest class. You can argue about whether or not this is actually a 5-gender system, because there are certain social roles that aren't split between all 5. So kalalai, the trans men, will perform the role of a heterosexual man. Kalabai, trans women, will perform the role of a heterosexual woman. They adopt children with a partner of the opposite gender. There's still this sense of opposites there, so you could really say it's men, women, and bisu people. I'd like to make it clear that you can both divide these genders up in different ways and see the structure according to different analyses. And also that I'm not saying this is the ideal human society, they have it worked out, the rest of us are awful. What I am saying is that it shows that the way we think about gender and classifying humans is not consistent from society to society and time to time, which you would expect it to be if it was so purely one-to-one correlated with sex. The second thing I want to say about this is that we already in our society don't correspond gender to sex. The thing is, sex is more complicated than we like to imagine. It's messy. There is no measurement that decides whether someone is male or female. It's a series of traits, a bimodal distribution. Watch a science video about it. It's very interesting. There are XY females, cis women born with male chromosomes, and XX cis men. There are intersex people who might be hermaphrodites or have other mixtures of traits, and these are exceptions, sure. Pretty big exception. It's estimated that about 2% of the population is intersex, but an exception nonetheless. But does it matter? We can't just ignore exceptions because they don't fit into our general picture. We have to consider them. There's not a single trait that we can describe that includes all cis men, but excludes all trans men regarding sex. What do we say? I mean, I already told you, chromosomes don't work. What is it, genitals? Hormones? Well, if some man was, against his will, castrated, his penis was removed and he was pumped full of estrogen, he no longer retains the male genitals or the male hormones. Is he now a woman? Something other than a man? No. No one in their right mind would say that. They would say, the person who did that is a criminal. They chopped your dick off and put a bunch of hormones into you. This doesn't define who you are. No, the only consistent definition of man that includes cis men, but excludes trans men, is that it's about what you were assigned at birth. That's what really matters here. The statement, gender is the same as sex, is a lie. They're lying to you. They don't really believe that. It's a way to hide a different belief. Except, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think the flaw in that argument is assuming that it was even a statement to begin with. But let's take a brief moment to talk about this video's sponsor, CuriosityStream. And in all honesty, this ad probably won't be able to show you how much I really enjoy this streaming service. You can watch thousands of documentaries and expand your knowledge on virtually any topic. Interested in history? You could do a quick detour on the Wild West, the Bronze Age, World War II, Abraham Lincoln. Or if you'd like to learn more about technology, you could watch documentaries on ships, fusion power, or how technologies could make us superhumans. I personally am not that interested in the natural sciences, but my girlfriend made me watch The Body and Reversing Alzheimer's anyway, and I do have to say that I enjoyed them moderately, even though they're not on topics I would normally watch a documentary on. As for my personal favourites, I can strongly recommend Secrets of the Brain, my favourite episode being episode 10 about a British man who awoke from a coma speaking French, and Trains That Changed the World. If you also want to gain access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series, you can use the link in the description box for unlimited access and use my promo code KCLIMB to get 25% off. Thank you so much to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this video. And let's get back to, in our roundabout way, talking kind of about gender. This is J.L. Austin's 1962 book, How to Do Things with Words, based on a series of lectures he gave in 1955. What I'd consider the main theory of this book is that of speech acts. Now, to understand those, let's first talk about performative verbs and the performative utterances they form. So, in a regular statement, there is something called a truth value. I could tell you, there is a carpet in my room. And now, you're just going to have to believe me, it's out of frame, but, it's there. However, you could, theoretically, track me down, go to my house just to stare at my floor and see if there's a carpet there. You could verify the truth of that statement. Thus, it has a truth value. Performatives, on the other hand, do not have a truth value. Take, for instance, something like the verb to promise. So if I said, I promise I will give this camera back after recording, then I'm not lying. I mean, I can't be. You can't go and verify whether or not I promised. No, the promise is in the words itself. The promise has been made through the speech act of saying it. So instead of using the terms true and untrue for these, Austin prefers happy and unhappy. So the happy outcome of this promise would be that I return the camera. If I instead fled the country, took the camera with me, and was never seen again, that would make it an unhappy performative utterance. But no one could go back and say that the promise was untrue. No, it's just broken. That's why we say that, instead of calling it falsified or something else. An interesting one that's on the topic of the video, something like, I declare myself to be non-binary, would also be a performative. The act is in the sentence itself. You can't say, did they really declare? But where Austin gets really interesting for me is about halfway through this book, where he goes, no, it's way more complicated than that. We can't just divide things into performatives and non-performatives. There's performative aspects to so much of what we say. Instead, he develops his theory of illocutionary forces. Austin describes locutionary acts, which are physical, literal things themselves that you say, versus illocutionary acts, which are the implicit acts that are actually going on in the background. He then uses the term perlocutionary acts for the desired result of this locutionary-illocutionary combination. A good example of this would be the sentence, do you have a bathroom I can use? So the locutionary act is the literal asking of that question, but you and I both understand that the asker doesn't really want to know whether the interlocutor literally has a bathroom and whether or not they literally can use it. No, there's an illocutionary act, a request to be allowed to use it, and perhaps for directions towards it. That's why we might expect the perlocutionary act in response of saying, up the stairs and down the hall, or wherever the bathroom happens to be. There's nothing in the locutionary act by itself that would cause the perlocutionary act to happen. It doesn't logically follow from each other. We have to understand that there's an illocutionary act happening underneath. The second thing that's very important to note about these performative utterances and speech acts is that their context matters a lot. Like a lot of actions, speech acts can be tied to rituals and things that happen around them. Saying I do doesn't really mean anything, but suddenly it's a very real and binding contract when you're standing in front of a wedding congregation. Unless you're just a random person who ran up to scream, I do, I guess, but you know what I mean. In the ritual context of an open platform, such as social media or K-Klein YouTube comment sections, some reason you all want to argue in there, I don't know why. The sentence, gender is the same as sex, cannot be taken as a simple statement. At least it's not just that. The first thing you notice about it is it doesn't really have a truth value. It isn't a descriptive statement about the state of the world. It's a declaration. You might as well say, I declare gender to be the same as sex. I define gender to be the same as sex. The thing is, it's not even really prescriptive, right? It's not saying how the world should be. It is definitely saying something about how the world already is, because it aims to change that. The locutionary act here of typing these things out on a keyboard is underpinned by the illocutionary declaration. The declaration against trans rights, against gender ideology or whatever. And the perlocutionary act, well, the desired result varies, I'm sure, from person to person. You'd have to psychoanalyze each of them as an individual. But in general, there is a will to roll back trans rights and change gender back to a simpler time when it just meant sex and we don't have to worry about all these things. To be clear, under this definition, the inverse is also a speech act. Saying gender is not the same as sex, or even I am trans, I am non-binary, those are also very real speech acts. They are doing things just the same as the inverse. But in my opinion, it's a happier speech act. It follows through on itself because it provides a better definition. So I think it's time to ask ourselves then, what is gender? What do I say gender is as the all-knowing YouTuber? What is my definition? This is Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, and yes, we are doing this twice in the same video. I have to prove I read these books somehow. This came out 2 years after Wittgenstein's death in 1953, which, if you've been paying attention, would put it as a big inspiration to Austen's work. One of the most interesting ideas from Investigations is that of familial resemblance. Wittgenstein rejects the idea that meaning can simply be ascribed as something that connects a word to a tangible thing in the real world. He rejects the idea that most everyday words have a scientific definition that can narrow them down. The age-old example of this is the chair. Yes, we're going to do the chair thing. I'm sure many of you have heard it before. There is no good definition you can construct for a chair. There's nothing you can do that excludes all non-chairs and includes all chairs. If we say, oh, it's a thing with 4 legs that we sit on, then you go, oh, so a 3-legged chair is not a chair, but a horse is. And then you can keep going like that, try to construct a more and more precise definition. But it's not going to work. There's always going to be an exception. In a lot of cases, it's even impossible to find a single uniting trait that all individuals of a class have. We say a chair is something that is made to be chair-like. It's made to sit on, to use as a chair. But say, for instance, we had a museum and they asked a carpenter to make a chair. It's a replica of the best chair ever, and it's going to be put in the museum, and it's never been sat on, it never will be, it wasn't made to be sat on, it was made to be looked at, and yet the sign on the display case says chair, whereas next to it, where there is a similarly made table that's only ever been looked at, never used in its life, that is not a chair. So instead, what really unites all the chairs and excludes all the non-chairs is not a single definition, but a series of familial traits. There are a series of traits we associate with chairs, a kind of chairness, and if you have enough chairness and not too much of any other thing, then that's when it becomes a chair. So the individual items that fall under an umbrella of meaning, like the word chair, don't necessarily have to share traits. They do, but no one of them needs to have all the chair traits, and some of them on the extremes of the spectrum might not share anything with each other, apart from the fact that we call them chairs. The only true definition is a self-reflexive one. A chair is a thing that we call a chair. Similarly, the way we've discussed the difficulties defining gender based on sex, there is no good definition for words like women and men that are not self-reflexive. Women are ultimately the people we call women. Men are ultimately the people we call men. These groups have a familial resemblance. No two women have to share any uniting traits to be women, apart from the fact that they are women. You could have people on the extremes that don't correspond to any given trait that we associate with womanness. This doesn't mean that biological factors, like chromosomes and genitals, don't add to what we consider to be a woman or a man. They're familial traits that not all women or men need, but they're still there in the set of associations. I prefer to see gender as a lens. It's a lens which we view someone through. In our society, when someone is a certain gender, they are seen in a certain way. They are seen in relation to their adherence with a series of familial traits that gender has. Now, this doesn't mean that what's essential to being a woman or man is a set of stereotypes. No, quite the opposite, in fact. You can be a woman and go against every single stereotype that womanhood has in our current society. And yet, because of those familial traits, the lens people see you through will be in relation to those. For instance, a man who is strong and courageous will be seen as masculine. A woman who is strong and courageous will be seen as a girl boss. Even if those traits on their own are the same, the way we relate them to the world around us is different based on what gender people are seeing us through. Self-identity is not only a consistent definition for gender, it is also a freeing one. It lets people choose what gender they want to be. It lets people request others to see them through a certain lens, or in the case of being non-binary, to see them through an entirely new lens, or no lens at all. That's, for me, what it's about, being non-binary. When I say I am non-binary, it is a speech act that implicitly requests that people cease to see me through the lenses of gender. I mentioned earlier that this definition was better. I used that word, more good. But why is it better? Well, that would be because it's more useful. The theory that gender is the same as sex, which really means, as we discussed earlier, that gender is whatever you were assigned when you were young, is confining. It confines us as humans, and I don't like that. I think we should be able to go beyond the mere toss of the coin of what we were born as. As humans, we correct ourselves all the time. Did you know some people are born with eyes that don't let them see far into the distance? Or we give them glasses or eye surgery. We correct that, we change it, because we don't say, you are confined to the way you were born, you are confined to being blind. That's one of the beautiful things about being human, not to be too soppy and humanistic about it. Let's turn again to Wittgenstein and investigations for a moment. Now, what I'm about to talk about is probably one of the most complicated ideas in modern philosophy, and people spend their whole careers debating what exactly Wittgenstein meant by this, so I'm not really sure I'll be able to do it justice. This, of course, is the idea of language games. What are language games? Well, in the very first chapter of Investigations, Wittgenstein lays us out with a hypothetical. We are to imagine a society of builders. This society has master builders and their apprentices, and they have a sort of primitive language they use to communicate with one another. The builder exclaims a word, such as pillar or slab, a certain part of a building, and the apprentice goes and gets it and gives it to the builder. This is a very useful communication system for them, so they can build more stuff. That's what this society does. Now Wittgenstein asks us to imagine, what does education look like in this society? He envisions a lesson, an exercise, in which the teacher points at an object, and the learner has to say pillar, slab, whatever it is the teacher is pointing at. This is a very simple language game. What Wittgenstein forces us to consider with this is the possibility that the initial interaction, the one between the builder and his apprentice, is also a kind of language game. There's no real difference between that and the naming exercise that the teacher is having with the learner. Wittgenstein then suggests that the entirety of language is built up of a series and a web of these language games. And there are explicit and implicit rules to these games, which define meaning and how we look at things. To give a fun and rather morbid example of this, let's talk about an oxygen tank. So you may not know this, I certainly didn't before I researched this to come up with this example, but an oxygen tank can actually be up to 50% not oxygen. Usually it contains nitrox, it helps with your breathing in some fun biology way. I don't understand it, but anyway, a lot of especially less experienced divers will use this only 50% oxygen tank. However, we still call it an oxygen tank, right? That would not be a lie. We could hand it to someone and go, here you go, an oxygen tank. If instead we had a tank that, rather than the 50% or so nitrox, had 50% mustard gas, we could not call that an oxygen tank and be honest. Which is actually kind of weird when you think about it, because both are tanks that contain the same amount and percentage of oxygen. For some reason, when you give someone an oxygen tank with nitrox in it, it's all fine, but 50% mustard gas, and they call the police on you. The thing is, there's a rule of the game that we don't trick people into dying. What I'd like to consider is gender, at least part of it, as a language game. In my interpretation of Wittgenstein, and once again, not the be-all and end-all, I would split the game into two parts: the rules and the play. Just like with all kinds of games, board games, card games, there is a set of rules, and then separate to that, but related to them, is the play, the thing that we carry out. It's not a real game if we're just reading the rule sheet. It's also not a real game if we're just throwing cards at each other and there's no rules to follow. I would suggest that the play of gender is the appropriate use of pronouns, terms, signifiers, all sorts of signs that we see around us in society. This is the linguistic application of the psychological lens that is gender. The rules of gender would then be who gets to be which linguistic category, and that is what's being fought over. When someone declares that gender is the same as sex, or indeed when someone declares the opposite, they are not making a statement of fact about the world, nor are they making a prescriptive statement about the way the world should be. No, they are engaging in a speech act which reflects back onto the language itself, changing the rules of gender. We are not fighting over whether gender is biological or if it is self-identity or any other definition you might want to come up with it. Nor are we fighting over what it should be. We are fighting over what it will be. And I, for one, when given the choice between confining people to roles and lenses that were given to them before they can even remember it, and giving people choice, the ability to request a new lens through which to be seen, well, I'll always fall on the side of freedom.